Authoritarianism rarely arrives with a marching band. It doesn't need to. It prefers the quiet work of corrosion, the slow hollowing out of legal institutions, the normalization of discretionary power, the steady replacement of shared civic reality with factional narratives. If there is one lesson worth extracting from the 20th century and applying ruthlessly to the 21st, it is that the most dangerous political systems are not the ones that abolish the law, but the ones that weaponize it. Political theorist Ernst Frankl captured this dynamic with chilling clarity in his analysis of Nazi Germany. He described a dual state, a regime in which a normative legal order coexisted with a prerogative sphere of arbitrary power. Courts, bureaucracies, and statutes continued to function, but only for those whom the regime considered part of the political community. For everyone else, the prerogative state, unbound by law, driven by ideology, reigned supreme. The point of revisiting this concept is not to draw moral equivalencies. It is to understand the mechanics of democratic decay, because the dual state logic did not die in 1945. It simply adapted. The modern dual state has softer edges but the same temptation. Today's authoritarian-leaning systems rarely advertise themselves as such. They hold elections, they maintain courts, they publish laws, and yet, beneath the surface, they cultivate a familiar duality. A rule-bound sphere that handles routine governance and a discretionary sphere, security services, emergency powers, informal networks that can override the rules when politically convenient. This is not totalitarianism per se. It is something more insidious: selective legality. Many contemporary regimes operate this way. Some rely on security agencies that function as a state within a state. Others use emergency powers as a permanent governing tool. Still others maintain a facade of judicial independence while quietly ensuring that politically sensitive cases land in the right courts. The details differ, but the structure does not. And in fact, democracies are not immune to dual state pressures. Even robust democracies face versions of these tensions. Polarization strains the legitimacy of courts and elections. Executive branches accumulate discretionary authority through emergency declarations and administrative waivers. Digital platforms create private spheres of quasi-sovereign power, while federal systems fracture into competing legal realities. None of this means a democracy is necessarily becoming authoritarian, but it does mean the conditions that make dual state dynamics possible are present. And democracies that fail to recognize these stress points risk sleepwalking into a world where legality becomes contingent, where the rule of law is something applied to one's opponents but optional for one's allies. That is the authoritarian temptation in its modern form. Fortunately, democracies around the world have not been passive in the face of these pressures. Many have adopted reforms that strengthen the rule-bound, institutional side of governance, the part Frankl would call the normative state. They have strengthened constitutional courts in Germany, South Korea, and Canada. They have expanded judicial review to ensure that no branch of government can unilaterally redefine the rules of the game. Electoral commissions in Australia, Canada, and the UK have removed election administration from partisan control, reducing the risk of contested legitimacy. And New Zealand adopted proportional representation. Ireland and Australia use ranked choice voting, which is a very good idea. And these systems reward coalition building rather than zero-sum warfare. Also, many countries such as Germany, France, and South Korea have tightened the legal boundaries around emergency authority, preventing it from becoming a backdoor for prerogative governance. Countries like Australia and Germany maintain nonpartisan bureaucracies that preserve continuity even when politics becomes turbulent. Independent oversight bodies such as anti corruption commissions, auditors general, and ombuds offices provide institutional watchdogs that operate outside of the partisan cycles. In addition, transparency and open government reforms in Nordic countries and New Zealand have robust freedom of information regimes that make it harder for discretionary power to hide. The UK, Spain, and Italy have used decentralization to diffuse national level tensions and reduce the stakes of central power. These reforms share a common logic. They reinforce the rule bound sphere so that the discretionary sphere cannot metastasize. The core lesson is that authoritarianism thrives where law becomes optional. The dual state framework is not a relic of the past, it is a diagnostic tool for the present. It reminds us that authoritarianism does not require abolishing courts or legislatures. It only requires hollowing them out, turning them into instruments of convenience rather than constraints on power. Democracies that survive do so because they recognize this early. They strengthen the institutions that make power predictable. They reduce the incentives for zero-sum politics. They build guardrails that do not depend on the goodwill of any single leader or faction. And above all, they refuse to accept the idea that legality is something that can be switched on and switched off, depending on who stands before the state. That refusal is the essence of democratic resilience. It is also the clearest rejection of authoritarianism's oldest trick, the promise that the rules will protect you, and only you, until they don't.